Hello everybody, welcome to Life is Chess. Today we shall learn how to exploit weak squares. We go through an example from the game of the first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz, which he played against Neumann in the year 1867. Many of you may wonder why I show so many games of Wilhelm Steinitz. Well, dear students, Steinitz was not only the first world champion, but he was also the first great teacher of chess who taught the principles of positional play. So we join action after 18th move by black. The opening had been very adventurous, but after 18 moves the game has settled down and black had just played the move g7 to g6. Looking at the position, we can very clearly see that both sides have their trumps. White has an active bishop on h3, which black does not have, a light square bishop, and this bishop occupies lots of important squares along this diagonal. Along with that, white also has exclusive right to this g file and especially a target on g6. On black side, black has f line, which is also very important, and white's king is little vulnerable to black's attack. So let us see how Steinitz handles this position. In 19th move, Steinitz played knight e2, a very instructive move. Notice how gradually he shifts his pieces towards the weak pawns and weak squares. Black played the move knight f5. Black had an alternative. He could have played bishop g7 with the idea of pressurizing on the f line, as well as placing the bishop on h4 from where it could attack white's king. Instead, he played the move knight f5, which has an idea of attacking this bishop as well as pressurizing this pawn and closing this diagonal. So black does have a lot of idea. White played bishop takes f5. White suddenly changes the pawn structure and we see there is no more a weak pawn on g6. The g file is no more exclusively white's because black can also contest the file. However, the f file is closed, so white's king is also safe. So lot of changes has taken place after the move bishop f5. We also see pawns are symmetrical. You have 4 pawns, one isolated pawn on f3 and one lone pawn on h2, and the same with black. Black also has 4 pawns, one pawn on f5 and one pawn on h5. So the pawn structures are absolutely similar, and it is very interesting to note from here onwards how Steinitz with white outplays his opponent. White played the move c3. Very simple move, a small move but very important because it overprotects the d-pawn so that the bishop as well as the knight can be free. They can be released from defense of d-pawn. Black played bishop d6, a nice move, bringing out his piece. And here white played a very instructive move. He played bishop f4. With this move, white not only offers to exchange black's active bishop, but also he eyes on the weak square e5. Notice black has a weak square on e5 and g5. Both these squares cannot be defended by his pawns. white does not have corresponding weak squares because the pawn on f3 supports both g4 and e4. In contrast, black's pawn on f5 is unable to defend e5 as well as g5. Notice the pawns have already advanced, they can't go back. So with the move bishop f4, white basically wants to exchange this bishop so that the defender of the weakness on e5 is removed. In language of chess, we call it white eliminates the defender. Black plays the move king c8. Here both sides have open file e file and g file. But if we look carefully, the g file is the file from where white is likely to penetrate. And also notice that the king on f2 actually defends the squares g2 as well as g1, g3. All these squares on these files are defended, the entry points are defended by white king. Correspondingly, black's king is far away from defense of these squares from where white is likely to enter. So the most important point in this position are likely to be the weak squares on e5, g5 as well as the squares on the g file along which white is likely to penetrate. So let us see how black plays. Black played the move king to c8. He wants to bring the king to the theater of action, which is likely to be the g file. Notice if black played rook g8, white would have contested the file. But more importantly, after a move like say king c8, this rook not only defends the g8 rook but also d6 bishop. So white would capture the bishop. Black is virtually forced to recapture with the pawn. That leaves the d5 pawn without a defending pawn, and white would, after exchange of the rooks, play knight f4, attacking the d5 pawn and h5 pawn simultaneously and winning a pawn. Therefore, black did not play rook g8. Black played instead the move king c8. White played rook g1 and black brought his king forward. In the end games, kings should be brought forward. They are very important pieces. There are less chances of being checkmated, so the king comes into the fray. White played rook g8 check. Black defended with the knight. The reason the rook on g7 is so effective, it actually invades into black's position and it forces black to play knight e7. That leaves e5 square less defended by the pieces. A few moves back, e5 was defended both by the knight and bishop, but gradually, as we shall see, white takes the g file, black comes forward with the king, and white takes bishop. After rook takes bishop, white plays knight f4 check. Notice with only 3 pieces, white places all the pieces in the most effective squares, and it not only attacks the king, it keeps an eye on a weak pawn h5 and also probable weak pawn on d5. Besides, black has a very important idea, and that is knight d3 finally entering in the strong square e5. So we see right from the first move, white had been eyeing this square, and gradually he has improved his position in such a manner he has removed the defenders of e5, and finally he seizes control of the square e5. Black plays rook b6 trying to activate the rook, and basically attacking the b pawn. If the knight moves, white plays b3, preparing for knight's jump into e5. White plays rook h6, trying to free the knight so that the knight at present defends g6 square. So rook has been brought to defense of that square. It's worth noting, had black played any move like knight c6, white could have checkmated black in one move by rook g6. Therefore, black plays the move rook h6 and white enters knight e5 with a deadly threat of knight d7 and capturing the rook. Well, it would be a double attack, a fork on d7. So finally white's knight does arrive on e5. If we compare this position to the first position, it did not look likely that white would be able to enter into the weak square. But notice how white gradually exchanged all black's defensive pieces, improved his position and finally achieved his goal. Black played the move rook b5. The only other way to save this knight d7 fork was king e6, after which white would have played rook e1 with a threat of discovered check, knight somewhere, either c4 or g4, attacking this rook or this rook. And as we shall see, the king cannot move to d6 because knight f7 would fork the king and the rook, and black cannot move to king f6 because that would allow a fork on the left side and white would win the other rook. So knight on e5 is very strong knight, as you can see. Black played the move rook b5 to evade knight fork on d7. White played a4, a brilliant move. White basically is trying to somehow trap the rook on b5. Apparently the rook can capture on b3, but if you look deeply into the position, you can find knight d7 check. Black has to move king e6, the only move, and then white plays knight c5 check, forking the king and the rook. That is why black cannot play rook b3. And here we see a very important principle of chess, that is, white gradually improved his position, placed his pieces on the best square, and finally when the pieces are placed on the best square, automatically fork and other tactics crop up in the game. So before getting tactics and combinations, it's very important to improve our position or to play very good positional chess. This is exactly what we are seeing, from positional chess to tactics. Black played the move rook a5, that is the only way how not to lose the rook for knight, and white played another brilliant move b4. Now the rook is getting smothered, it doesn't have many squares to escape. Notice, if the rook captures a4, once again white has sacrificed a pawn. White would play knight d7 check, checking the king. The only move is king e6, and once again knight c5 check, forking the king and the rook. So the rook is really getting smothered, it doesn't have many squares to go. It has to go to rook a6, and now once again the simple tactics, knight d7, king e6, knight c5 check. White wins the exchange and it is overwhelming material advantage. Black gave up. So dear students, I hope you enjoyed the game, and from this game you learnt a very important lesson, how to occupy weak squares by first creating weak squares and then exchanging the defenders of the weak squares, and stage 3, occupying the weak squares with our pieces, and only when our pieces occupy commanding position, only then we can get combinations and finish the game. So thanks for watching. For more instructive videos, keep watching Life is Chess.